Hey y'all, it's Professor Marinos again, and today we're going to move on from nitrogen to talk about the other element that we kind of view as central to this puzzle of how life fits into geochemistry, and that is phosphorus. So, by the end of this video, I want you to be able to outline the major steps of the phosphorus cycle, describe the progression of phosphorus limitation in terrestrial ecosystems, and finally describe the primary means by which phosphorus is mobilized. So the first thing that distinguishes the nitrogen cycle from the phosphorus cycle is that while nitrogen has an atmospheric source, all phosphorus is ultimately of geogenic origin. So specifically, phosphorus comes from the mineral apatite, of which there are a few forms. There's hydroxyapatite, which is calcium phosphate with a hydroxyl group, fluorapatite, which is the same formula with just a fluorine instead of a hydroxyl, and chlorapatite, which just substitutes chlorine for hydroxyl. And so all phosphorus ultimately comes from the earth, and it's the weathering of these phosphorus-bearing minerals, such as this chlorapatite shown here, that ultimately results in there being phosphorus available in solution for plants and microbes and other organisms to take up and use in their stoichiometry. So let's consider the dissolution of apatite for a second. Let's consider hydroxyapatite as an example. In this reaction, you have calcium phosphate hydroxide dissolves congruently, this is a congruent dissolution reaction, into 5 calciums, 3 phosphates, and a hydroxyl group. And you'll note that because there's a hydroxyl group that comes into play here, that this is obviously going to be a pH-dependent reaction. At high pHs where you have a lot of hydroxyls in solution, this reaction won't proceed very far forward in the forward direction because the equilibrium concentration is going to be governed in part by the hydroxyl concentration. At low pHs, where you have less OH in solution already, this reaction can proceed much more readily in the forward direction. But something that's really important to note about phosphorus is just take a look at this K value, 5.01 times 10 to the negative 62. The solubility constant of this reaction, so the amount of phosphate that can dissolve into solution, is vanishingly small actually, and it doesn't even really matter at what pH. It's either going from minuscule to almost non-existent over the full range of environmental pHs. Calcium phosphate is incredibly insoluble in the environment, and this is one of the defining features of phosphorus biogeochemistry. Because phosphate is so insoluble in the environment, organisms have to go to great lengths to acquire the phosphorus that they need, and this is why it's often such a limiting nutrient in a lot of ecosystems, because even though there might be a lot of phosphate bound up in the rocks, it's incredibly inaccessible to organisms because this equilibrium that you have here for the dissolution of phosphate-bearing minerals is so small. This is a very, very insoluble mineral. Such that even, just to do out the thermodynamic calculations for you, if you take a rock of hydroxyapatite and stick it in a jar of water at pH 7, your phosphate concentration at equilibrium will be only 504 nanomolar. So very, very, very little phosphate enters into solution. This, of course, is promoted by acidic conditions. And further, not only is it promoted by acidic conditions because you're changing the hydroxyl concentrations in the water as you change pH, but you also have this protonation reaction that can move more phosphorus species into solution. Just like, a carbonate can gain 1 or 2 protons to become bicarbonate or carbonic acid, so too can phosphate protonate. It can gain between 1 and 3 protons to become monohydrogen phosphate, dihydrogen phosphate, or trihydrogen phosphate, also known as phosphoric acid. And because of this protonation reaction, just like your total inorganic carbon concentration in solution is greater than just your carbonate ion in solution because you also have the protonated forms that you have to add into your total phosphorus concentration. You also add into your total soluble phosphorus concentration these protonated forms. And so when you have lower pH, you have more of these protonated forms forming, and as a result, you have more phosphorus in solution. So acidic conditions do promote the availability of phosphorus to an extent, or the solubility of phosphorus, but only to a very limited extent. It's going from being, like I said, vanishingly insoluble to only very insoluble. So all phosphorus in the world ultimately comes from apatite. And apatite is a mineral. It's a mineral resource. And we extract this mineral resource to grow our crops. Millions of tons of phosphate fertilizer are distributed across farmlands across the globe every year. And all of this is ultimately of geogenic origin. And because it's a mineral resource, it's a finite resource. And current estimates are that we only have about 240 years of phosphorus left at our current rates of phosphorus consumption as we fertilize our agricultural fields with it. And so it's likely that in the next 100, 200 years or so, that phosphorus is going to become a rather hot commodity in the world as we start to deplete our economically viable reserves of phosphorus. And something that's really interesting about phosphorus is that you'll note on this bar graph here, this is the global phosphorus reserves. The United States has about 2% of the world's total phosphorus, mostly in Florida. But one country, Morocco, has 70% of the world's phosphorus reserves. Indeed, we used to think that we only had about 100 years of phosphorus left, and then we went out to Morocco and discovered a giant mountain that was basically all just apatite. And so that increased our reserves a lot, our current estimated reserves. But Morocco by far dominates the world's phosphorus supply, particularly in an area called Western Sahara, which is a unrecognized political entity within Morocco that is currently fighting a long, low-grade civil war with the central government of Morocco. So you have, as phosphorus gets more and more scarce, you might see some kind of hairy geopolitics going on in northwestern Africa as a result of the world depleting its economically viable phosphorus reserves. Maybe that's 100 years off. Maybe that will never happen. I don't know. I'm just editorializing. But, you know, it's a strange picture when one country that's so tiny has so much of the world's phosphorus, a vitally important nutrient for our crop production. Okay, so let's start to construct a terrestrial phosphorus cycle. We said that all phosphorus is ultimately of geologic origin. It comes from apatites. And weathering reactions, congruent weathering, produces phosphorus in solution. And the soluble phosphorus is the form that both plants and microbes can take up. And so this step, just like with nitrogen, is called assimilation into biota. So you have microbes and plants that are hanging out in the soil, and they assimilate soluble phosphorus into their tissues. And like I said, plants go to great lengths, and microbes also go to great lengths to do this. They spend a lot of their resources, in the case of plants, they spend a lot of photosynthesate sugars that they produce in their leaves, go to seeking out phosphorus in the soil. How do they do that? Well, there are a lot of mechanisms that plants have evolved to seek out phosphorus. But one of the most important ones are these fungal symbionts called mycorrhizal fungal symbionts. So mycorrhizal, myco is a prefix that means fungal. Rhizon means root in Greek. And these are fungal roots, basically, that are intermingled with the actual roots of the plant. And these mycorrhizae grow into the plant roots and kind of form like an extension of the plant roots. And these mycorrhizae are shown here. They're like these very white, gauzy things that you kind of see surrounding these darker brown plant roots here. And so these white, gauzy fungal filaments called hyphae dramatically increase the surface area of the entire root structure. You know, these roots are big and bulky. Even the tiniest roots are much, much, much bigger than these mycorrhizal fungal hyphae that grow through the soil. And so there's a trade-off. Plants give sugars to these mycorrhizae, and in return, these mycorrhizae seek out phosphorus and give it to the plant. It's a symbiosis. And this is a metabolically expensive symbiosis. It takes a lot of sugar to keep these mycorrhizae happy. And so the plant is investing a lot of resources into doing this. But the payoff is great too, because they get the phosphorus that they need that they otherwise wouldn't be able to acquire. And this is basically just a function of greatly increasing the surface area that the roots can access phosphorus from, and also these fungi are able to secrete enzymes to acquire phosphorus that the plants can't secrete. So yeah, mycorrhizal fungi are vitally important for the phosphorus cycle on inland ecosystems and really drive a lot of the phosphorus acquisition. Okay, so plants assimilate phosphorus. It's in their living tissues, but then plants and microbes die, as everything does. And when plants and microbes die, they enter this organic phosphorus pool. And this organic phosphorus pool is very important for the cycling of phosphorus because this organic phosphorus pool is relatively easier compared to apatites for microbes and things to access. Microbes and plants can access this organic phosphorus by secreting enzymes called phosphatases, which come to an organic molecule and are able to cleave off phosphate groups on that organic molecule such that the phosphate groups enter into solution. So organic phosphorus is a relatively accessible pool of phosphorus that plants are able to attack with their enzymes and to create soluble phosphorus again from them. And this process, just like in the nitrogen cycle, is called mineralization. Plants will secrete phosphatases, microbes will secrete phosphatases, break down organic molecules to produce soluble phosphorus again, soluble phosphate, via the process of mineralization, just like the process of creating ammonium was called nitrogen mineralization. And yes, again, plants and microbes go to extraordinary efforts to cleave these molecules. So this is the general reaction that you see. You have substrate is your organic substrate that the phosphate's attached to. And you have this hydrolysis reaction. Water comes in, and you swap out the OH of that water onto the substrate. So you're substituting hydroxyl for phosphate. And then you have a hydrogen phosphate that bumps off the other side. And this enzymatic machinery to do this, these phosphatases are very expensive again for plants and microbes to build, but the reward of being able to cleave off this phosphate and access this phosphate is worth it for them. And it's important to note that this all happens outside the cells. So plants and microbes will secrete these enzymes just out into the soil with no guarantee of getting any phosphate back. You know, that phosphate could just float off to some other microbe or could float off to some other plant root. But it's so vitally important for plants and microbes to acquire phosphate that they secrete these outside of the cell enzymes or extracellular enzymes into the soils, just on the off chance that they'll be able to recover some of this phosphate that's been cleaved off of these organic molecules. Okay, so now we have the rudiments of a phosphorus cycle. You have inputs from weathering of apatite, which contributes soluble phosphorus. The soluble phosphorus is assimilated by plants and microbes. These plants and microbes die, and their remains become organic phosphorus in the soil. And then through extreme efforts of plants and microbes to obtain this organic phosphorus, this phosphorus is remineralized into the soluble phosphorus pool, where this cycle can begin again. But as we've discussed before, this isn't the only possible fate of phosphate in solution. One of the most important fates of phosphate in solution is the adsorption to clay particles. And we've already discussed this in depth, so I won't get into this too much, but this adsorption reaction is vitally important to the total phosphorus availability in soils. And at any given time, you have much more phosphorus in any soil adsorbed to mineral surfaces than you do actively cycling in this pool here. These iron phosphates that are formed and aluminum phosphates are very, very insoluble. So let's just take a look at that real quick again. This reaction mechanism, you have hydroxyl groups on the edges of clay particles that are covalently bonded to iron here. And you just have a substitution reaction. You have phosphates coming in, bumping off those hydroxyls, and then coordinating with the oxygens that are then bonded to iron. So this is the adsorption reaction. As we discussed before, this is highly pH dependent. At low pHs, these surface groups become protonated, and so as a result, the negative charge of the phosphates is attracted to these protonated surface groups and forms this bond much more readily. And so at very acidic pHs, you have this adsorption mechanism that strongly sequesters a lot of phosphorus. So at low pH, you have higher weathering rates of apatite, but this adsorption mechanism totally counterbalances those higher weathering rates due to lower pH. And so what you end up having is kind of this sweet spot around circumneutral pHs, where you have enough weathering of minerals to supply phosphorus to an ecosystem, but you don't have this mechanism playing such a huge role. So around circumneutral pHs, you tend to have the highest phosphorus availability in terrestrial ecosystems. But there is a way to get around this iron phosphate trap, which is the dissolution of the entire mineral. That bond between the iron and the oxygen and the phosphate is very, very hard to break. But you can get around this by just completely dissolving the iron oxyhydroxide or iron hydroxide that this phosphorus is bound to. So here you have iron hydroxide bound to phosphate, and you produce iron 2 plus, NOH minus, and a phosphate in solution. And what I really want you to notice here is that you have iron bound to 2 hydroxyls and a dihydrogen phosphate, which has a 1 negative charge. So 1 negative, 2 negative, 3 negative. This iron has a plus 3 charge. And so it goes from plus 3 to plus 2. This is the reductive dissolution reaction that microbes perform as a result of iron-reducing metabolisms. So this is a microbially mediated process that results in the reductive dissolution of iron phosphates to liberate phosphorus. And so this only happens in soils that there's not a lot of oxygen in, such as shown here. The soil with these gray features is a soil that is highly reduced. Like we said before, these red clays here are very indicative of iron oxides, rust. Rust is red. That's what gives these soils their red color. When you have this reduction reaction happening, all that red color leaves it and you get these very, very gray soils. So phosphorus availability is going to be much higher in these soils that are waterlogged and have a very, very low redox status, a redox potential, compared to these highly oxidized soils shown over here. This is probably almost entirely saturated all the time. This soil over here is probably very, very rarely saturated. So the reductive dissolution of iron is a primary driver of liberating phosphorus in the environment from these sorption mechanisms. So you have clays and iron oxyhydroxides binding the phosphorus in soil very, very tightly. And that bond is very, very hard to break. But there's one way around it, and the way around it is simply by just dissolving the entire mineral that's binding up that phosphorus. And this is what happens somewhat in soils, and this generally only occurs when soils are very waterlogged and when there's no oxygen availability in soils. So consider this reaction here. You have iron hydroxide bound to a phosphate. And so if we just consider the charges of these groups, this dihydrogen phosphate has a -1 charge. Phosphate is -3, add 2 hydrogens to it, -1. This hydroxyl group has a -1 charge. And so -1, -2, -3, because there are 2 of them. This whole anionic group here has a -3 charge. That must mean that this iron here has a +3 charge. But look over here on the side of the equation. Now it only has a +2 charge. Its charge has been reduced, and this is a redox reaction. This is a redox reaction that will only occur in the absence of oxygen, because if oxygen's around, it will just reoxidize this iron again. So this only happens when there's no oxygen in the soil. You have what's called the reductive dissolution of iron. Reductive because it reduces the iron and it dissolves the crystal as a result of that reduction. And this liberates the phosphate that's bound to it. So this reductive dissolution can supply phosphate to an ecosystem again, even if it is very tightly sorbed to the oxidized mineral. And like I said, this only occurs in the lack of oxygen. And so this is a good example here of a soil where you'd see this happening in. You see over here on this side, this very, very red soil. This red color is due to iron oxide, rust. Rust imparts a very red color to soils. Whereas you look over here, this has become gray. And that's because in this soil over here, all of the oxidized iron has been reduced by microbial activities that convert this iron 3 plus into iron 2 plus. And this only occurs, like I said, in the lack of oxygen. So these are generally soils that are very, very flooded, that oxygen can't get down from the atmosphere into the soils. So flooded soils tend to have higher phosphate availability sometimes because you have this reductive dissolution of sorbed phosphorus that releases phosphorus. So yeah, flooding can release phosphorus, which can increase phosphorus availability in solution. Okay, so we talked about adsorption to clays as a primary means by which soluble phosphorus is removed from the environment and prevented from participating in this organic phosphorus cycle. But there's another important off-ramp that I want to talk about, and that is the formation of secondary minerals through precipitation reactions and then redissolution reactions to move back into the soluble phosphorus pool. And unlike the formation of sorbed clay phosphate complexes, this precipitation of secondary minerals is favored at high pHs. So this mechanism of phosphorus occlusion is favored at low pHs. This method of phosphorus occlusion, or binding up of phosphorus in unavailable forms, is favored at high pHs. And the reason is simply that, like, you're basically just reversing these dissolution reactions. We said these reactions in dissolution are favored at low pHs. At high pHs, the reverse reaction is favored, precipitation. So if you have a lot of calcium and phosphate in solution and at a high pH, a lot of hydroxyl, what you're going to do is you're going to precipitate out apatites that are then essentially just new minerals that exist in the soil that need to be reweathered again before that phosphorus becomes available. So yeah, at low pHs, the iron phosphate occlusion method is a dominant method of phosphate being removed from the active phosphorus cycle, and at high pHs, this reprecipitation of mineral forms is the favored mechanism for removing phosphorus from solution. Okay, so now this kind of completes a in-place sort of phosphorus cycle. We have weathering of the primary minerals into soluble phosphorus. We have this biological phosphorus cycling between living tissue, dead tissue, and back to the soluble form, assimilation, death, and mineralization. And then we have these two off-ramps that are really important. We have the sorption-desorption mechanism onto clay surfaces, which happens at low pH, and we have this precipitation of secondary minerals and then redissolution of these secondary minerals, which predominates at high pH. But we know that phosphorus is also lost from terrestrial ecosystems. Well, how is it lost? Well, there can be some leaching of soluble phosphorus. You can have soluble phosphorus that just leaches into groundwater or into rivers. But because the amount of phosphorus that's soluble at any given time is so incredibly small, this actually is a very, very small term. But consider these pools, organic phosphorus and clays. What can happen to those? Well, these can just erode from the landscape. Both organic phosphorus and clay particles in heavy rainstorms, for instance, can just get swept off the land surface. And this erosion mechanism, so the erosion of non-soluble phosphorus, a phosphorus that's bound up in one of these forms, is the dominant mechanism by which ecosystems lose phosphorus. So just to sum this up, erosion of P adsorbed to mineral surfaces is the dominant mechanism of loss from terrestrial ecosystems, but also some organic P plays into that here, too. And I'm sure you've seen a river after a heavy rainstorm, such as this one, and you see this, this brown, muddy color that's in the river. This is all clays carrying phosphorus just moving right on downstream. And so you can move an incredible amount of phosphorus with the power of water, particularly if your landform is particularly susceptible to erosion. And so this is, like I said, the dominant way that phosphorus is lost from terrestrial ecosystems. And we as humans do a ton to promote this loss of phosphorus. One of the biggest things that we do is we till our fields. You know, we till our fields to control weeds, to incorporate organic matter into the soil, a variety of reasons why we till agricultural fields. But this tillage just sets up ideal conditions for erosion. You've destroyed all the roots in the soil, so the soil is no longer bound together by roots. You've created all these furrows that water can run in. And so when we till our soils, we actually create a huge source of erosive material that can then be swept into our waterways. And this is one of the primary means by which we lose phosphorus in ecosystems, is the usage of extensive tillage. Another way that we lose phosphorus in a different setting is through clear-cut forestry. You know, the same principle applies, like you've killed all the trees here. These trees are only going to grow back very, very slowly. The roots are going to rot out. They're no longer going to hold the soil in place. And so when you do clear-cut forestry, what you see is massive erosion coming off of these hill slopes, especially if it's in a hilly terrain like this one, and tons of phosphorus bound to clay particles entering your waterways and just eroding away. And we've recognized that this is a big problem. It's not only a problem in terms of phosphorus pollution, but it's also a big problem in terms of money. You know, farmers don't like to throw away their fertilizer. If they apply, you know, $100 of fertilizer per acre, phosphorus fertilizer per acre 1 year, and then 50% of it is lost to erosion 5 years later, that represents a huge loss to farmers. And so there have been a lot of practices that have been encouraged among farmers and foresters to try and reduce the amount of phosphorus that is eroding off their landscape attached to clay particles. One of these biggest efforts is conservation tillage, shown over here. And conservation tillage is basically just reducing or eliminating the tillage of soil. When you eliminate the tillage of soil, it's called no-till farming. And so you can see this happening. What farmers have done is they've just laid down their crop residues. The crop residues just sit on top of the soil and form basically mulch. And then they just plant on top of these crop rows. And weed control, weed control is one of the primary goals of tillage. Weed control in this instance is performed by either herbicides or by tractor-mounted flamethrowers, which are really awesome to watch. They'll just come by and singe all the leaves of the weeds before they go through and plant their crops. But conservation tillage is something that's really taken off in the United States over the last 20 years. Farmers have really come to recognize the benefits of this. They see improved soil health, they see improved crop yields, they see reduced time that they spend in the field doing all their tillage. And so conservation tillage is a very effective practice that's really taken off to reduce the erosion of soil and thus the loss of phosphorus from ecosystems. Forestry is a bit of a harder example, but there are some practices that foresters do. They'll do strip cutting where they don't clear cut an entire block, but they just slice out little strips of the forest. They'll also plant riparian buffers around a stream. So there's a stream here running here, and a riparian buffer is just a line of trees around this stream that hopefully prevent erosion. This is a pretty anemic example here. It's probably like 3 meters wide and was probably only done to satisfy some regulatory requirements. But responsible foresters will plant wider swaths of buffer strips around clear-cut areas, or they won't clear-cut at all in an attempt to reduce phosphorus fertility. And again, this is economically beneficial to foresters as well, because the regrowth of their forest tract depends on the phosphorus fertility of the soil. And so by preventing erosion, they hopefully will see a net gain as well in improved yields and quicker regrowth of their forest tracts that they've logged. So a lot of effort goes into reducing erosion for a lot of reasons, but phosphorus retention is one of the main reasons. And these practices can dramatically decrease the phosphorus loss in ecosystems. So eventually, though, ecosystems will lose phosphorus. Over geologic timescales, the phosphorus of an ecosystem decreases and decreases and decreases over time. And there's a very influential model that describes this decrease over time, the Walker and Sires model from 1976. And what you have here on the x-axis is time since the beginning of pedogenesis. Pedogenesis is just a fancy word for the start of soil formation. And so over here you have very, very young soils, and over here you have very, very old soils. And on this y-axis here is the total amount of phosphorus in the ecosystem, and it's been partitioned into a variety of different pools. And so we'll just kind of walk through this. At the beginning of a soil being formed, you have a lot of phosphorus there. And all this phosphorus is bound up in apatite minerals. So when soil starts forming, if you're just forming a soil on bare rock, you have a lot of rock, not a lot of actual soil, but that rock contains a lot of phosphorus. And this is all bound up in this primary mineral pool. Primary mineral means an unweathered rock. And so, as weathering progresses, what happens is this phosphorus starts getting gradually lost, but the amount of phosphorus in the ecosystem not in primary minerals starts increasing pretty rapidly. And Walker and Sires segregated this into 3 different pools. You have the organic pool, which is self-explanatory. This is the phosphorus that's in organic matter, the dead remains of plants and microbes. You have this non-occluded pool, which is phosphorus that is not very tightly sorbed to mineral surfaces or, not plant available. So this is plant available inorganic phosphorus that is being weathered from primary minerals. And then you start to see this formation on top here of this red zone, the occluded pool. And these are phosphates that are either bound to iron or clays. And this is a phosphorus. This represents a phosphorus fraction that is not readily accessible by plants, or it's occluded. And so over time, you see a gradual decline in phosphorus fertility as the primary minerals are all weathered out, until you reach a point where you don't have any primary minerals left. The weathering horizon of the soil has extended far enough that you're outside of the root zone of even your deepest rooted trees, and so you have no more production of phosphorus from these primary minerals. And at this point, you're just cycling between this non-occluded pool, this organic pool, and this occluded pool. And this occluded pool, again, is very, very hard to access, though. And as time progresses, this non-occluded pool goes away. And the reason why this non-occluded pool goes away is because soils generally become more acidic as they age. And so as the soil becomes more acidic, you have more likely formation of this occluded iron and aluminum oxyhydroxide bound to iron pool. And so you have more and more phosphorus being lost from the ecosystem. And at some point, the only pools you have left are organic phosphorus, which is basically the only plant available form anymore, is phosphorus that's bound to organic matter, and this occluded pool. But your phosphorus fertility keeps getting less and less, and your plants get more and more desperate for phosphorus, and they invest more and more of their energy to acquiring phosphate from this organic pool. And at the very end of soil development, or pedogenesis, you have what's called the terminal state of phosphorus unavailability. This is a very, very phosphorus-poor ecosystem on a very old soil where phosphorus is a very, very strongly limiting nutrient. So over here, there's a lot of phosphorus. It's likely that in these areas, nitrogen is going to be your limiting nutrient in terrestrial ecosystems. But as your soils get older and older and older and older, you end up with phosphorus limitation in your very oldest soils. So just to restate this again, phosphorus in the ecosystem becomes progressively more limiting as ecosystems get older due to the depletion of weatherable phosphorus from primary minerals and the enhanced absorption of soluble phosphorus to clays and other mineral surfaces. So where do we see this phosphorus limitation? Well, like I said in the previous lecture, we tend to see this in areas that are highly weathered, ancient, and flat. Very, very weathered because the weathering makes the soils more acidic and increases the prevalence of iron and aluminum oxyhydroxides. Ancient because you only have the time to do all this weathering if your soils are millions of years old. If you have a glacier that comes by every 10, 20, 30,000 years and scrapes your soil clean and you start over with fresh bedrock every 30,000 years, you're not going to get to this state of phosphorus limitation because you don't have the time to weather. It's only in places that have been very geologically stable, tectonically stable, and unglaciated that you can see this phosphorus limitation generally. So very, very old soils on the order of hundreds of thousands to millions of years old. And Matt discussed this in the weathering video with the Hawaii chronosequence that he discussed. The oldest island in Hawaii is about 4 million years old. And on that island, you see a very, very strong phosphorus limitation of the ecosystem because those soils have been weathering for so long. And you see this most often, although Hawaii is a counterexample, in very flat ecosystems. And the reason that you see it in flat ecosystems is that in very steep ecosystems, you have constant erosion of the soils on top, exposing fresh bedrock beneath, and so that fresh bedrock acts as a new source of phosphorus. So it's in very flat, ancient areas that you see this. This tends to be tropical rainforests. The Congo Basin is a great place where you see this play out. Very, very flat. Africa is a very, very tectonically stable continent. And the Congo Basin particularly is a very flat area. You see this in the lowlands of the Amazon too. Over in the Amazon close to the Andes Mountains, you have enough erosion from the Andes and weathering from the Andes that you don't see as much phosphorus limitation. But on the eastern side of the Amazon, you tend to see phosphorus limitation as well. So yeah, phosphorus limitation is common in weathered ancient flat soils, which tend to be the best examples of this are in tropical rainforests. Okay, so that's all I have for you. We've discussed both the terrestrial nitrogen and the terrestrial phosphorus cycle, two of my favorite things to discuss in the whole world. Now we're going to move on to what happens when these elements leave the terrestrial ecosystem, either through leaching in the case of nitrogen or erosion in the case of phosphorus, and enter into aquatic ecosystem. What is the ultimate fate of these nutrients as they move into freshwater and marine ecosystems? So I'll see you then.